Last time, we talked about the challenges climate change will pose to livelihood strategies, particularly the livelihood strategies of the 30% of people globally who farm or are otherwise involved in agriculture. This time, we'll talk about what is viewed in most cases as an overwhelmingly positive adaptive strategy to dealing with the physical impacts of climate change: migration. U.S. politics around migration are unbelievably fraught at the moment, but more often than not, and in more places than not, migration is not the stressor, but rather the release valve. Let's start with some basic terminology. International migration is the temporary or permanent relocation of an individual, household, or community across an international border. Immigration is the process of leaving a location. Immigration is the process of arriving at a new location. Internal migration, or the same type of movement that does not cross an international border, is in fact far more common. My guess is that most of you are internal migrants, having moved once or twice for a variety of reasons. I'm an internal migrant several times over. Born in Virginia, my family then migrated to Michigan for better economic prospects. My mother and father divorced, and I began to seasonally or circularly migrate between California and Michigan, with educational opportunities in Michigan and work and recreational opportunities in the Central Valley. I then migrated to San Diego, California for educational opportunities, where I made friends, met my future wife, and became a Chargers fan. They eventually migrated to Los Angeles, but that's another issue entirely. I then migrated three times, to Denton, Texas, Williamsburg, Virginia, and finally Denver, which is now my home. We don't tend to think about these types of moves as migration, which is too bad. If we did, perhaps the term migrant would be less stigmatized than it is in many circles. The concept of migration is related to 2 or 3 other concepts we'll discuss at length in this course. Forced displacement refers to being forced to abandon one's native location, such as when Europe's Jews were forced to leave Nazi Germany and occupied territories on pain of being sent to concentration camps. Refugees are displaced persons forced to cross international boundaries and who cannot return home safely. An example would be the Syrian refugees in Europe and the broader Middle East we discussed last time. Finally, there are internally displaced persons, or IDPs. Essentially, refugees who are displaced internally in their country. They don't cross a border. The Ugandans who wound up living in resettlement camps in that country during the war with the Lord's Resistance Army are an example of IDPs. Climate change, and the anticipated population movements that will come with it, as people leave less habitable areas in search of new homes and livelihoods, has given rise to the concept of the climate migrant or climate refugee. Though difficult to forecast, more than 1 billion people may wind up migrating due to climate change, with 250 million of those likely moving across international borders. Even if the precise number is not known, it's likely to be a very, very big number. And that big number will come with a host of issues, both good and bad. So why do people migrate more generally? For many of us, our home communities are places of safety and security and recognition. We know our environs, both natural and social. We know who to count on in hard times, and we know where we stand, how we are valued by our community.
And see the world and move away and, be a part of something so much more interesting than my little town. We all think our towns are like no fun, right? There's never anything to do in the town where you grew up. But having that song and now me being an adult, getting able to go back, see my parents, spend time there, and feel so blessed that I grew up there and feel so
Of course,
lucky.
this is
I
not true
wouldn't
for
have
all
liked
of
to grow
us.
up anywhere else.
For some, their
And
hometown
I
might
was
feel
dying
more
to
like a
get out when I was a
straitjacket than a
teenager,
life-affirming
but now
ecosystem.
I'm so glad to get to go
But
back.
whatever
I'm so
their
glad to
reasons,
have reasons.
migration comes with huge costs, both in terms of things lost and adjustments that need to be made. Imagine that tomorrow you find that you have to move to Mexico, right now, with one suitcase at your feet. What do you do with your belongings? How do you say goodbye to friends and family? How do you get there? Will it be safe? Let's assume you make it to Ciudad Juarez, a Chicago-sized city right on the south of the border of El Paso, Texas. What do you do? Do you speak Spanish? What kind of assets, physical and human, do you have at your disposal? My point is not that you need to know the answers to all these questions. My point is that this is an arduous, not easily arrived at decision. Even today, the decision is incredibly difficult and complicated. But imagine that same decision for Irish people fleeing the potato famine in the 19th century. When they waved goodbye, they were waving goodbye. There was no WhatsApp or Facebook for them. It was see you, never. These decisions are governed by push-pull dynamics. Push-pull dynamics are the combination of push, i.e. factors governing why you want to leave, or factors making current livelihoods unsustainable due to conditions in the region of departure, and pull factors, i.e., why you would want to go, or factors making relocation more attractive due to conditions in the arrival region. These are the factors that people have in mind when they decide to migrate. In terms of push and pull factors, the dominant drivers, or factors that people take into account when making the decision, are economic prospects and human security, the economic conditions they face at home and what those conditions imply for their families, and the good or bad human rights conditions they face at home. The biggest push sources of outmigration in the international sense are poor economic prospects and weak respect for human rights. The biggest pull sources of in-migration in the international sense are good economic prospects and better respect for human rights. Let's start with incomes. Let's assume you are a high school educated Nigerian male working in a factory in Lagos. If you simply relocated to the United States and got the same job, you would earn 10 times more, and that's actually accounting for differences in cost of living. If you were that same person in Yemen, the difference would be 18 to 1. Sounds pretty enticing, right? That's before we talk about the differences in respect for human rights. Things are bad in the United States right now, no question. But the degree to which our civil liberties are respected still makes the United States a very attractive destination for migrants fleeing repressive, autocratic regimes and persecution. This diagram illustrates the broad calculus, whether to stay or to go, pretty nicely. Environmental factors are just one part of the equation, but they're an important part, especially in regions where livelihoods are highly dependent on those environmental conditions. Environmental conditions are part of a broad suite of drivers that determine likelihood to want to move. Personal and household characteristics, i.e. what kind of assets they have, both physical and human, and the permissiveness of the political, social, and physical environment, i.e. how easy or hard it is to actually migrate, determine the ultimate decision. When we link these decisions back to climate change, we need to think about the effects of slow versus rapid onset environmental changes. Let's take a rapid onset change, one that happens quickly, over a matter of hours or days. Now, let's talk about a slower onset change, like a drought or slowly declining agricultural productivity over time.
Anna Lessenger and her family are heading to an area in northern Kenya where they've been told there's enough water and pasture for her livestock. It will take them a day to walk there. There's a drought in parts of Kenya. Months of rain have just ended, but weather experts say it wasn't enough and millions of people are likely to suffer worsening food and water shortages.
It did not rain where we were, so we had to come this way to a settlement area where my animals can survive.
Herders from different parts of this region are bringing their animals to areas such as Maralal, where it has rained. But frequent droughts and scarcity of resources often causes conflict between herders.
Given these two scenarios, which of the two do you think is more likely to result in mass, rapid migration? This distinction, and the rapidity and scale of climate migration, matters a lot for whether we think that migration will result in human conflict. We'll talk about why in coming weeks. For present purposes, slow onset means a slow trickle of migrants over time. Rapid onset means a big flow of migrants in a short amount of time. Climate change will produce both.
Dear refugees.
Dear refugees.
Dear refugees.
Dear refugees.
What if the United Kingdom never welcomed you in? Without a safe home to find your voice, the world would never hear it, and so many would never find their own.
The doors you opened for so many behind you would stay closed.
Modern art would have lost its fearless leader.
The story you needed to tell, and that the world needed to hear, might never have been written. Millions of hearts and minds might never have been opened or challenged.
Imagine if you never found your chance to become the greatest midfielder of your generation.
Refugees just like you would never be given the chance to survive. Because you fought for their right to protection, you gave them a voice.
I wouldn't have my friend, and we wouldn't go on all our adventures.
We would miss that one song that made us feel invincible. Dear refugees. A world without you, it just wouldn't be our world.
Dear refugees,
Innovators,
Teachers,
Neighbors,
Sisters and brothers,
friends,
leaders,
artists.
you made so much more than history. So what will today's chapter say?
As much as images like this pull at our heartstrings, and as much as people sacrifice to migrate, it's important to note that migrants are generally the lucky ones. For every person who successfully migrates, there are perhaps one or two others who would like to but can't. These are called trapped populations. Trapped populations are both unable to move away from the environmental threats and lack resilience and resources to address the environmental challenges they experience. These are the poorest of the poor, the folks who are facing terrible circumstances but lack the physical and social capital or assets to move. For example, the RAND Corporation estimates it costs $6,000 to $10,000 for a pollero, or human smuggler, to safely get you across the U.S.-Mexico border.
No va a parar. Siempre vamos a ver personas que quieran pasar, que ellos lleguen y pues cada quien su objetivo, ¿verdad? Ellos lograr llegar a donde van y tratar de cumplir su objetivo y uno tratar de pasarlos para ganarse un peso.
About a third of Mexicans live on less than $5 per day. That's less than $2,000 per year. If you have $6,000 to $10,000 to invest in migrating, are you the poorest of the poor in Mexico? Probably not. We don't have to look to international migration to see examples. We can look in our own backyard. Let's talk Hurricane Katrina, a large Category 5 Atlantic hurricane which caused over 1,800 deaths and $125 billion in damage in August 2005, particularly in the city of New Orleans and the surrounding areas. The city's evacuation plan, which was only announced 19 hours before the storm hit, presumed that most people would have access to cars and reliable public transit. The poorest of the poor in New Orleans had neither. Ultimately, some 60,000 people were left behind, forced to either shelter in place under terrible conditions or brave the Superdome emergency shelter.
We're at the 20-yard line in the Superdome. The 20-yard line in the Superdome, and look at it. The air is thick. The smell is nauseating.
I spent only a fraction of the time thousands of terrified people spent in here, but I couldn't wait to escape the suffocating atmosphere of this nightmarish place.
Which residents were left behind? These images tell the reality of the situation. It was people already marginalized within their own communities. These populations are the folks with limited opportunities to move. There's no release valve. And as the poet Langston Hughes asked,
what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
In a few weeks, we'll begin talking about what happens when things explode.